At a time when global markets and Canadian political leaders are holding their breath, the U.S. president is on the edge of a trade showdown. Donald Trump's sweeping tariffs on imported goods send shockwaves through industries, since a staggering percentage of the fuel and energy that keeps U.S. businesses running comes from Canada. And if tariffs hit, costs could skyrocket, businesses could collapse, and consumers could feel the sting at the pump and beyond. However, how will the real impact of these tariffs on fuel imports from Canada be troublesome for U.S. businesses and consumers? And will Trump admit all his failures or push forward? Join us as we reveal what Trump finally confesses. Canadian fuel is the backbone of American agriculture and industry. Just days before announcing a sweeping set of tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, only to pause them later, President Donald Trump made a bold claim. The U.S. doesn't need their crude oil, lumber, or any of their resources. Speaking to reporters on January 30th, before his official announcement, Trump doubled down on his belief that Canada and Mexico had taken advantage of the U.S. for years. Look, Mexico and Canada have never been good to us on trade. They've treated us very unfairly, and we will be able to make that up very quickly because we don't need their products, he asserted. We have all the oil you need. We have all the trees you need, meaning the lumber. We have more than almost anybody in those two categories and more than anybody in oil. We don't need anybody's trees. However, a week earlier, during a virtual address to the World Economic Forum on January 23rd, he made an even sharper jab, this time singling out Canada directly. Canada has been very tough to deal with over the years, and it's not fair that we should have a $200 billion or $250 billion deficit, he complained. We don't need their lumber because we have our forests. We don't need their oil and gas. We have more than anybody. But how much truth was behind these statements? Although the U.S. does indeed have enough crude oil and lumber for domestic use without importing from Canada and Mexico, cutting that supply would not be anywhere near so simple, nor would it result in the reactions predicted by Donald Trump. The process would be slow. Prices would rise. Infrastructures would need to be tailored to a different configuration, and businesses that relied on steady Canadian imports would be under pressure overnight. Lumber shortages could send housing prices skyrocketing, while a disruption in crude oil imports would ripple through transportation, manufacturing, and countless industries tied to fuel. They didn't just warn about the economic consequences befalling Canada and Mexico. American businesses and consumers, as warned, would be hit harder by such consequences. The big question then was whether Trump was ready to take those consequences instead of once again overstating America's self-sufficiency. The latest Bureau of Economic Analysis data shows that the United States registered a trade deficit valued at $41 billion in goods and services with Canada in 2023. If Trump had confined his ramblings to the trade deficit in goods, that would have been around $72 billion, still falling well below the jacked-up numbers he laid out. Because when it comes to making economic arguments, truth has never ever been Trump's forte. Sure, it is proven that the U.S. is producing more crude oil today than any other country has ever. Yet, that doesn't mean it can sever imports forever. The reality is far more complex than that. American refiners need a particular kind of oil, not merely oil, the kind supplied by Canada and Mexico. America extracts predominantly lighter crude, the only heavy crude, which can be from Canada, Mexico, and many more. In addition, experts assessed that if the U.S. stopped importing that crude, the refiners would need months or even years to reconfigure their systems for storing and processing oil, which would require a huge capital outlay. Until things could be set up, energy prices might shoot up, increasing the price of gasoline and other finished products in the U.S. market. The lumber industry is a little different, but all the same, it presents a unique set of challenges. Cutting off imports from Canada would create shortages and greatly increase the prices of homes, heavy construction materials, and furniture, thereby affecting business owners and homeowners alike. The environment would be a major factor here. There are different rules for timber operations in Canada, and more loggings within the U.S. to offset imports from Canada would only attract environmental scrutiny and stress the ecology. These things notwithstanding, Trump proceeded with his sweeping new tariffs on February 1st and placed a 25% tax on imports from Mexico and Canada by executive order. A slightly lower 10% tariff was placed on oil from Canada, signaling some acknowledgement of the necessity of 10% tariffs. However, no further than 2 days later, on February 3rd, the administration slammed on the brakes and announced that the tariffs would be paused for 30 days. On paper, the notion of American energy independence might be quite appealing. However, this is not as easy as turning off foreign supply and depending solely on domestic production. The U.S. energy industry has been founded considering the gradients of different crude oils, and, for the moment, Canadian and Mexican imports are an integral part of that trapezium. Whether Trump's tariffs will ultimately stand or whether economic reality will force him to reconsider is a question of time. The U.S. hit a new record in 2023, producing over 12.9 million barrels of crude oil per day. The estimate by the Energy Information Administration, EIA, shows an even higher output in 2024, topping 13.2 million barrels per day. Trump has made no secret of his position, with tens of billions of barrels in proven reserves remaining underground for even more production. Given these numbers, some might assume the U.S. is entirely self-sufficient regarding oil. Carrie W. King, a research scientist at the University of Texas at Austin and assistant director of its Energy Institute, pointed out that the country extracts more crude oil and natural gas liquids than it consumes as refined products. According to the latest EIA data, the U.S. isn't just producing record amounts of oil. It's also a major exporter, shipping out nearly 4.1 million barrels per day in 2023. Nevertheless, the reality is more complicated. In a recently updated Congressional Research Service (CRS) report, experts explained that U.S. oil trade with Canada and Mexico isn't just about volume, but logistics, refinery configurations, and crude oil quality. Not all crude oil is the same, and not all refineries are built to handle the same type of oil. Geographic proximity, an integrated pipeline network, and refinery specialization all play critical roles in the flow of crude between the three countries. This is why cutting off imports from Canada and Mexico isn't as simple as pumping more oil at home. The U.S. imported approximately 3.9 million barrels per day from Canada in 2023, with another 733,000 barrels per day coming from Mexico. Those two countries supplied over 70% of all U.S. crude oil imports that year. Without those imports, many U.S. refineries, designed specifically for heavier crude from Canada and Mexico, would be forced to undergo costly and time-consuming infrastructure overhauls to process the lighter crude produced domestically. That kind of transition doesn't happen overnight and certainly doesn't come cheap. However, the U.S. could theoretically attain self-sufficiency in oil production, but that would not be easy. According to David Gantz, a fellow in trade and international economics at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, full energy independence would require major and costly restructuring of U.S. refineries. It isn't just a matter of producing enough oil, he noted. It's producing the right kind of oil. For decades, American refineries have been optimized to process heavier crude oil, which is cheaper, Mexico, and other countries. However, most oil extracted in the U.S. today is lighter, less dense crude, a shift that began with the shale boom of the 2000s. The problem: most U.S. refineries were built long before that boom and were designed to handle different types of crude. Oil imports are the lifeblood of the American refining industry. Carrie W. King, an energy expert at the University of Texas at Austin, noted that refineries make huge capital investments to fine-tune the process for a given crude oil blend. If that crude oil mix is altered suddenly, the efficiency of the whole refining process is compromised, leading to production bottlenecks, enhanced costs, and possible fuel shortages. That is one of the many reasons the U.S. is still exporting millions of barrels of crude oil, despite producing more than it can consume. Refineries in other countries are better suited to process the lighter crude produced in the U.S. and more than 70% of American refining capacity is set up for heavier crude, according to the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers AFPM. However, reconfiguring these refineries to accept more U.S.-sourced oil would be painstaking and outrageously expensive. According to the AFPM, this process could take years and cost billions. Even if it would be too late to make modifications to the refinery infrastructure, there remains another challenge: transportation. The United States has no sufficiently large pipeline network to transport crude oil and refined products produced in the country. Moving oil from where it is extracted to the refinery and then on to consumers would need vast new investments in infrastructure. Simply put, the U.S. oil industry is not set up for sole reliance on domestic crude. Canada, in contrast, is in a long-standing strategic position to be a supplier due to its geographic location and a well-integrated pipeline system. The August report issued by the Energy Information Administration, EIA, analyzed Canada's growing role in fueling U.S. refineries and explained that Alberta's massive production area of oil flows directly into the U.S. Midwest and Rocky Mountain area using an extensive pipeline and rail network. Thus, Canadian crude oil is assuredly reliable and cost-competitive, and therefore, it is a vital cog in the American energy equation. Without such imports, the U.S. would face logistic adjustments, higher fuel prices, slow refinery activity, and economic malaise. While this may sound nice in theory, the practice is something else entirely. To say the least, stopping the flow of Canadian and Mexican oil would present an extremely important political gesture, but one that may very well turn the economy upside down from coast to coast, affecting all industries, businesses, and consumers. In theory, David Gantz acknowledged, Trump's claim that the U.S. could function without oil imports from Canada and Mexico is technically true, but only if the country were willing to overhaul its refinery infrastructure and develop a comprehensive transportation strategy to move oil efficiently across regions. But in practice, it's not true at all, Gantz said bluntly. Refineries across the U.S. are calibrated to process specific grades of crude oil, and switching to an entirely domestic supply isn't something that can happen quickly or easily. Retrofitting refineries to handle a different crude mix would take years and cost billions, a transition neither the industry nor consumers could afford to rush. Interestingly, Gantz pointed out that the Trump administration seemed to acknowledge this reality, at least to some extent. When Trump announced his sweeping 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, crude oil was notably given a lower 10% tariff. That suggested somebody in the administration understands that this is not a product which can be easily replaced, Gantz noted. Moreover, despite the implications of this policy, the White House remained silent when asked how Trump planned to compensate for the potential loss of Canadian and Mexican oil imports. Without a clear strategy to offset these imports, the administration's approach raised more questions than answers, leaving refiners, economists, and industry experts wondering whether Trump's push for energy independence was based on political rhetoric or a realistic economic plan. Do you think putting tariffs on imports from Canada would be troublesome for U.S. businesses and consumers? Do you also agree that the president's statement may not be wrong, but still misleading? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more.